So I'm going to stick in the Gospel of Luke, and we are in Luke 13, starting with verse 10. And I'm going to read the passage first, so you might want it in front of you. It's on the outline, maybe on page 2 or so of the outline, but you can find it in the Bible under the chair in front of you on page 872, Luke 13, starting with verse 10. And as you notice from the screen, we're going to be dealing with the issue of Jesus and Sabbath, when a blessing becomes a burden. And we're going to be doing some kind of deep-water historical study. Surprise, surprise when Joe's up here. But hopefully it'll be enlightening, and we'll get something we can take out of here with respect to what Sabbath means in our own lives. So let me read the passage, and then we'll give you a roadmap for my time with you, and then we'll jump in. Luke 13, starting with verse 10. Luke writes, "Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, 'Woman, you are freed from your disability.' And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, 'There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, not on the Sabbath day.' Then the Lord answered him, 'You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from this manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?' And as he said these things, all of his adversaries were put to shame, and all of the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him." Now, again, at one level, this is very straightforward, isn't it? I mean, what do we need a sermon on about this? The Pharisees and Jewish leaders, synagogue rulers, are all mean-spirited, and Jesus is all full of compassion, so he heals this person. And, Sabbath is not a legalistic law that marginalizes people. It's an opportunity to heal, to restore and be restored. Clear as a bell. Let's just have some more worship songs and go home. Some of you are saying amen. But there's much to learn by situating this conflict between two people who have two very different views of Sabbath, Jesus and the synagogue leader, this Jewish religious leader, situating this in the flow of history. And so what I want to do is I'm going to take us all the way back to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and lay out a template of God's intention, God's design for the Sabbath, what he intended the Sabbath to be. And then we're going to take that template and walk it through Jewish history and all the way out to the time of Jesus and test the way Sabbath is being understood by Jesus' fellow Jews and by Jesus himself in light of this original design for the Sabbath. And I think it'll be a very, very kind of helpful way to walk through this. So Sabbath in the Torah begins with the giving of the commandment as part of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. And here's what we read. "Remember the Sabbath day." Again, part of the 10 Commandments Moses got at Sinai after Israel came out of Egypt. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, or your son, or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Now, a couple things about this commandment before we comb through the Torah and see what God's design for Sabbath is. The first thing to notice about this commandment, it's the longest of the 10 Commandments. Some of them are just a couple words. You shall not steal. Even the idolatry commandment, not to worship idols, is only 3 verses long. The Sabbath commandment is 4 verses long. So it's pretty important. Second thing about this commandment, this is the only time the word holy appears in the 10 Commandments. Notice what I've highlighted up here. The description of the Sabbath as holy. This is like bookends. It's like this must be the main thing we need to know about the Sabbath, but because it occurs at the beginning and at the end of the commandment. Notice, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Down at the end, last sentence, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We need to figure out what that means. What it doesn't mean is, it's not related to the idea that holy means sinless. Holy can certainly mean sinless when we use it to talk about God. But how can the Sabbath be sinless? It must mean something else, mustn't it? And we're going to figure out what that is as we unpack this today. But let's start way back in the first 5 books of the Bible with God's design for Sabbath. What did God design this commandment to do? Well, first of all, it was a time to rest. And most of us are aware of this aspect of the Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. In my line of work as a university professor, I get a sabbatical now and then. I'm on sabbatical right now. And the word sabbatical, for those of you who are linguistically challenged here this morning, is related to Sabbath, isn't it? And the interesting thing is when we come back from sabbatical, we have to give a report to our fellow faculty at a faculty meeting about our sabbatical. And the reports that are the most impressive are not the ones where somebody gets up and says, I had a sabbatical. I refreshed myself, I rested. The reports that are impressive is when somebody gets up there and says, on my sabbatical, I finished this book, I published this journal article, I spoke at this conference, I did this, and I'm going, my goodness, there seems to be something oxymoronic, contradictory about a sabbatical report being all about what the work you accomplished during your sabbatical. I mean, I could say something like, somebody could ask me, Joe, how's your sabbatical? I bet you're really busy, getting a lot done, which is the typical thing you get from your peers when you see them when you're on sabbatical. What if I told them the truth? Well, no, not really. I'm preaching a few sermons and, playing a few tunes on my piano and just really having a sabbatical. Why do I feel guilty in our culture answering like that? It's because our culture doesn't rest. We don't rest. We're double income. If we're working for SpaceX, we're working 80 hours a week. Go, 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 go. Where's the margin? Where's the margin? Okay? Secondly, we learn from Torah that Sabbath is a time to trust. It's a time to trust. You might remember back when Israel came out of Egypt, they didn't bring any food along. Hello, what are we going to eat? What are we going to eat in the wilderness? Well, God says, I'm going to feed you. And God gave them supernatural food from heaven. It's called manna, which in Hebrew just means what? Which is kind of cool, But here's this manna coming down from heaven. God feeds them every single day, except for the Sabbath, Saturday. And they were to trust God that if they took the Sabbath off and didn't run out and gather manna and work, that God would take care of them anyway. With 6 days of work was enough. And so notice the commandment. The Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the Sabbath day. This took a lot of trust. It took a whole lot more trust later in Israel's history when they obeyed the Sabbath year commandment and they didn't sow any grain in the field on the Sabbath, trusting that God would provide, see? It's this issue of trust, isn't it? That we just obey God, do what he says. God will take care of us. God will take care of us. When I was born in 1952, my dad ran a shoe store downtown Hermosa Beach. From 1952 until about 64 or so, he ran a shoe store down there. And they were never open on Sunday. In fact, he'd come home Saturday at noon. He'd work half day Saturday often. And he wasn't the only business. Back in the 50s, very few, if any, businesses were open on Sunday. Those of you whose hair is the same color as mine or getting close are nodding in agreement. You remember those times when you couldn't go buy something on Sunday because most of the stores weren't open. Now, almost everybody's open on Sunday. There's an exception or two. Anybody know what they are? Yeah, I call it Hobby Lobby too. Yeah, I call it Chick-a-Fil because the very first time I saw the Chick-fil-A sign, I don't know, I never had dyslexia, but it kicked in and I saw Chick-a-Fil. It's been Chick-a-Fil to me ever since. So it is what it is, okay? But yeah, so here is a business that says, look, we're going to trust that if we give our employees, our maidservants and our male servants, a day of rest, that God's going to take care of us. And he certainly has, hasn't he? He certainly has. And here's what's so interesting and fascinating to me. I find it so ironic that we live, folks, post-World War II in the West in the most economically prosperous era and culture of any in world history, and yet we're the ones who have decided we need an extra 7th day of work to survive. These people in the ancient world were living hand to mouth, and God still tells them, no, trust. Work 6 days, God will take care of you. Okay? Third characteristic of Sabbath, God's design for Sabbath. Sabbath was a time to care. Sabbath was a time to care. I don't know about you, but when I am really busy and I'm preoccupied with my own agenda, I kind of have blinders on to the needs of others. And the Lord just reminded me today of a classic illustration of that. When I preach on Sundays, I try to get here like a 7 or so. So we have a meeting at 7:45, and I got to get a mic and make sure the clicker works on the screen, get the PowerPoint loaded up. So I try to get here by 7. And on the way, I stop at Manhattan Bread and Bagel up there and get a oatmeal or a scone or something. And there's a homeless guy who hangs out there. And his name is Fred. And Fred and I have kind of struck up a friendship. He's a believer, loves the Lord. And so when Fred's there, I buy him breakfast on the way by, take it out, and I drive to church. And what I discovered is if I am on time, and I have plenty of time to get here, I'm much more likely to see Fred as an opportunity to be kind rather than an obstacle to my agenda. But if I'm running late, like I was today, it's a different story. He's more an obstacle to my agenda, I have to, than a want to, isn't it? So that's how I think we operate. But Sabbath is a time to care. Again, we see that right in Torah. We got a hint of this in the Ten Commandments. It's specified even more so in Deuteronomy 5, where it says, "You shall not do any work, nor your son, your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or your livestock." So don't make your dog fetch the paper on Sunday. Or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Fourthly, Sabbath, according to Torah, is a time to reflect. A time to reflect. And of course, Israel gathered to worship. Later, Jews gathered in the synagogue. And it's interesting that two great characteristics of God, God as creator, God as redeemer, creation and redemption, are tied to Sabbath keeping in the Torah. Notice, time to reflect on creation. Time to reflect on creation. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in it, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. It's a connection between creation and Sabbath. The implication being, it's a great time for us to reflect on creation. It's also a great time for us to reflect on redemption. Here again, Sabbath is tied, this time, not to God's great act as creator, but to his great act as our redeemer. Remember, Moses says, "You are a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." Now, why might Sabbath be tied to God's great acts of redemption, or creation and redemption in history? And by the way, this is an aspect of Sabbath we're practicing right now, aren't we? We are gathered to reflect on the greatness and the love of our God. God as creator, his greatness, God as love, redemption. And what happens here is when we reflect on God as creator, we are reminded that God is in control. That God is in control. We get to stop, put everything else on hold, and be reminded that God, not Joe, is in control. And we think of God as Redeemer, we're reminded that God is on our side. God is on our side. These new fancy electronic keyboards are very different than the old electric piano and organ that I played on back in the rock and roll 70s. They have computers and all these different sounds, and you can dive down and you can edit things and you can get all these cool things to happen. But you can also make a total mess of your instrument too. It's kind of like life. Life is complex, and we can enjoy these complexities, or we can make a mess of our lives with these complexities. And on my keyboard, there is a button. It's variously called the panic button, maybe a little more objectively, the reset button. And what that button does, if you're in the middle of playing and you're doing a gig and you push enough buttons to get all confused and mess up your keyboard, if you hit reset, it resets it right back to all the factory specs, and all your sounds are where they started. And folks, this aspect of Sabbath, the time to reflect, this is our reset button, folks. We spend our time out in the world and we get busy with the chaos and the pressures of life, and pretty soon we begin to not really think, maybe God's not in control. We take control and make a mess of things. Or stuff happens and life happens and we begin to wonder, does God really love me? Is God on my side? And we come back to church, we come back to our a piece of our Sabbath here as we gather together and worship. We are reminded through the songs, we're reminded through the message, we're reminded through looking at the joy in one another's eyes as followers of Jesus that God is in control and God's on our side. We need a reset, not just weekly, but daily, and we'll talk about how we apply the Sabbath to our lives, but certainly this is a great illustration of that application right here as we gather on Sundays. And finally, and this will be new to you, I suspect, Sabbath is a time to separate. Sabbath is a time to separate. What we mean by this was Sabbath for Israel was one of their markers of their otherness, their uniqueness of God's people as compared to the pagan nations. Israel kept the Sabbath, the pagan nations didn't. That's how you could tell who God's people were. Sabbath was a marker of Israel's identity, and that's where this holy stuff comes in. And again, we see it in this verse. This association of the word holy with Sabbath is all over the Torah. Notice here again from Exodus 31 now. We saw it in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from among the people. So there's an association with if I am one of the people of God, I keep the Sabbath. If I'm not, I'm cut off from God's people. I'm not one of the people of God. Sabbath was an identity marker. Now, this needs a little more explanation because we're going to take this and run with this through Jewish history in a minute. So a little bit of explanation about this holy stuff, okay? Sabbath as holy. God, the Bible says again and again, God is holy. What does that mean? Well, it means more than that God is morally pure. God is sinless. That's part of it. But what holy means is God is different. God is other. God is unique. God is separate from all the other pagan deities in the ancient Near East, and God is unique other than the created order. God is utterly unique. He is holy. And in the Torah, it says, you are to be holy because God is holy. And what that means is, Israel, you are to be different. You are to be other. You are to be radically different than the nations around you because your God is holy. And so we have a holy people and we have outsiders. In the Old Testament, it's the Israelites, earlier the Canaanites. And we also have this idea of God's holiness being reflected in Israel also in the practices. So Israel has a holy land as well that is to be other than any of the other real estate on the planet. And there were to be no Canaanites in the land, no unholy people in the land. Israel didn't obey that commandment. This is part of the mix here. Israel also has holy other distinct food. Obviously, holy is not being used of sinless here. How can food be sinless? It can't be, but it can be different. And so Israel has a whole set of food laws that are to mark them out as unique among the nations in the ancient world. In fact, you might hear people talk about the laws, the kosher laws in the Old Testament, and give all kinds of medical or physiological justifications for why God commanded Israel not to eat pork and on and on. And some of that may be the case. It may be healthier in that culture to eat the way they did, but the Bible says nothing about that. The only place the Bible explains the purpose of the food laws is in Leviticus, where it talks about the food laws marking out Israel as different, as holy, as other from the nations around them. And so also is the Sabbath. And this is why Sabbath is called holy. It's an identity marker for the people of God. And we saw this right in the text here where it talked about whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be cut off from the people. People of God keep the Sabbath. People who are not the people of God do not. It's a marker of identity. So here is our template. This is God's design for the Sabbath according to the Torah. And so now we're ready to rock and roll here. We're ready to take this template and move it through Jewish history to try to figure out what got into the head of that synagogue ruler who got all bent out of shape at Jesus for healing that guy. And what's gotten into Jesus' head that he turns around and heals this woman in this, I'm thinking of another the guy, woman, in the account. And I think this will shed a lot of light on what's going on in Luke 13 to walk through this pilgrimage. So now we move to Sabbath in Jewish history. And by that, I mean after the Old Testament is over, even a couple hundred years after the Old Testament is over, the Israelites, it's maybe 200 BC, a couple hundred years before Jesus, and the Israelites are no longer the Israelites. A lot stays the same, but a lot changes. Now we have the people of God, the holy people, they're called Jews, And we have those who are not the people of God. They're called Gentiles. You're familiar with those terms from the New Testament, surely. What stayed the same during this period was how you tell a Jew from a Gentile, how you tell an Israelite from an outsider. The Jews kept kosher. Okay? They kept kosher. They ate the food God prescribed in the Torah. They were under the Torah. They kept Sabbath. And that was one of the things that marked them out as different. And you'll notice I've substituted temple instead of holy land, and there's a reason for this. It's very important. The land was no longer holy because now the Gentile empires were in control. First the Greeks, then the Romans, and those dirty Gentiles were trampling all over the land. There was no way to keep them out. And so what Israel had left as far as sacred space, the only place the Gentiles were not allowed was in the inner courts of the temple. So the temple basically displaced the land as sacred space, preeminent. And just as a little to anticipate where we're going, isn't it interesting that the conflicts Jesus gets into in the Gospels surround these three things? Food, he got in trouble for eating with the wrong people. His disciples got in trouble for not washing their hands before they ate. Sabbath controversies again and again and again in the Gospels, and all the hassle he had in the temple with the authorities when he overturned the tables. So we'll come back to this and see that this makes a whole lot of sense to understand all these kind of things together. So what happens then, because of the Gentiles being all over this place and us being under the thumb of these kingdoms, the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, is all of a sudden these practices became really, really important. Because we didn't just have a place to go to see who God's people were. Now now the place was, you find all kinds of people in the land of Palestine. How you knew who was in and who was out, who were the people of God, was Sabbath and food. And so then these boundaries became really, really important. Now, this system worked pretty good for hundreds of years under the Greeks and the Romans. As long as the Jews paid their taxes, first to the Greeks, then the Romans, the Greeks and Romans let them be Jews and keep the Sabbath and do their food thing in the temple. In fact, this is really what it meant to be a Jew. Classical writers, Herodotus, Tacitus, Strabo, every single one of them, when they're describing what a Jew is, none of them talks about Jewish theology, what the Jews believe. They all talk about Jews. They're Sabbath keepers. They won't eat with us. They eat their own food. And they have their temple. This is what defines a Jew big time from this point out. And again, this worked fine. We see it in the New Testament working in the sense that, the Jews are maintaining their identity as a people of God. But there was an exception. In 167 BC, there was a nutcase Greek emperor named Antiochus Epiphanes who decided he did not like Jews being Jews. And so he attacked the Jews and he outlawed Sabbath, food, temple, and tried to basically erase these distinctives that marked out the Jews as different than the Gentiles. And he tried to turn the Jews basically into Gentiles. Here's his commandment. It says, "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should give up their particular customs, and the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to forbid burnt offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals." He added, "And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die." Now, what if all of a sudden we had a secular ruler in the United States of America who had the power and exercise it to outlaw our faith? We couldn't gather on Sunday anymore. We couldn't read our Bibles. How would we respond? Would we just become like the pagans and say, "Oh, well, I guess that era of my life is over. I'll just, give up my faith"? Well, that's not how the Jews responded. A few of them bailed, but most of them maintained their faithfulness to Torah, even at the cost of their very lives. And here's an example where Sabbath is concerned. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. Those who had assembled in the caves nearby to observe the Sabbath day secretly were betrayed to Philip, one of the Greek governors, and were all burned together. They were burned alive because their piety, their holiness, kept them from defending themselves in view of their regard for that most holy day. So here are Jews rightfully, because this is what God told them to do in their Bible, rightfully going to the mat, being willing to die for their faith in Yahweh. And this was true not just of Sabbath, it was true of those who refused to eat pork. That was kind of the litmus test of giving up your Judaism. You had to eat pork, and on this went. So these Jews were willing to stay faithful, but they did more than that. They fought back. These Jews fought back to the Greeks. They started this little guerrilla warfare, and they got stronger and stronger. And they knew in their Bible, Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, God said, if you obey the law, I will lift you high above the nations. And here they're determined to obey the law, even if it costs them their lives, and fight for their integrity as a people of God. And amazingly enough, just 3 years later, they beat off the Greeks, and everything went back to normal. They got their temple purified, the Greeks rescinded the commands, and they were able to keep Sabbath, they were able to do food, and all this kind of stuff. But you can imagine now the way the Jews began to think. Wow, we were being oppressed by these Greeks, and because we were willing to go to the mat and die for our faith, God showed up and gave us victory and chased these suckers out of here. And so all of a sudden, these practices became quintessentially what it meant to obey the law. All the other stuff, background, Sabbath keeping, food, temple, our ancestors died for these things, and all this focus began to be put on these practices. And there, from about 164 BC to the time of Jesus, there arose a movement led by a group we're going to call the Super Jews. The Super Jews. You know who the Super Jews are. They're the Pharisees. They're the Essenes. They're these groups of Jews who are just going to double down on Sabbath and food. And you think about it, it began with a kind of a noble goal of making sure that what happened to us under Antiochus Epiphanes would never happen again. And so here comes all this focus on Sabbath and food that we come across in the Gospels and rabbinic literature. Crazy stuff. We have rabbis debating in rabbinic literature about when you tie a knot, how many loops become work on the Sabbath. We have them debating in rabbinic literature about what happens to a guy with a wooden leg. If he makes a Sabbath journey, is he carrying that piece of wood and working? Or is it now part of him? And the rabbis went back and forth, back and forth. I almost went back and over. Yeah, so here's what's going on here is they're basically taking the boundary between us and them, and they're moving it in tighter. Because remember, these practices defined who was part of the people of God and who was not. So all of a sudden, because of these super Jews, these Pharisees and Essenes and others, maybe just 10,000 total out of all of Israel, all the rest of the Jews are marginalized and off the table because they can't keep up with this program. They're just scratching their lives out. They're just, they're walking around with a wooden leg figuring out if God loves them while these rabbis are debating whether they're in or out. And this stuff's going on. And it's these Jews who have been marginalized by the hot super Jews, this high-intense purity program. It's the Jews that are being marginalized that Jesus cares for, isn't it? These are the ones he goes after during his earthly ministry. So this is what happens. Now, what we want to do, again, is run what we've learned about Jewish history through our template. Back up on the screen is God's design for Torah, or the Sabbath according to Torah. So what can we say now about Israel, or about Jewish history? Okay, the first one is a time to separate. A time to separate. Clearly, that has become huge for these intertestamental Jews. And we see this highlighted in a book called Jubilees that if we had time to look at it, it's all about Sabbath, And this is what this fellow writes. He says, separate yourself from the Gentiles. Do not eat with them. Do not perform deeds like theirs. Do not become associates of theirs, because their deeds are defiled and all of their ways are contaminated and despicable and abominable. Ugh. But that's the mentality. Now, here's what happens, folks. There's a bigger lesson to be learned here this morning than just a lesson about what happened to Sabbath. The lesson is this. Our personal experiences and our experiences as a people, as a culture, profoundly influence our theology. We might think we have immaculate perception when we open our Bibles. We don't. We are profoundly influenced by the teaching we've heard in churches we've been a part of, the Christian culture around us, the family we come out of. And the first step to reading the Bible as it was written is to acknowledge and recognize that. And we see that so clear here as God's original design for Sabbath has been markedly skewed and compromised because of historical experiences. Okay? So a time to separate. A second thing we notice is that when one aspect of our theology and life gets overemphasized, something's got to give. And so we see our intertestamental Jews still showing up at the synagogue to rest, to trust, to reflect perhaps, but Sabbath as a time to care has almost come completely off the radar screen. And so in John 5, Jesus heals this guy who over 30 years has been sick and is trying to get dipped into this healing pool. Jesus comes along and heals this guy. And you would think everybody would stand around and just be praising God. Awesome miracle. And one of the Jewish leaders goes, he's not allowed to carry his mat on the Sabbath. Here's this guy walking for the first time in 30 years, and that's what they're bent out of shape about. And we see the same thing here. The ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, there are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. So, what does Jesus think about all this stuff? Okay, well, we're going to go back to our template, right? This is our kind of our guideline to walk through here. And we've seen what happened in Second Temple Judaism with the Sabbath and how a time to separate became the big deal, a time to care off the table. So what is Jesus up to when he comes into this setting? Well, he is going to restore Sabbath as a time to care. He's going to look back at Torah. And he's going to see what's going on here, and he's going to restore Sabbath as a time to care, isn't he? So he does all these healings in the Sabbath, very intentionally too. You know, in the Gospels, every time Jesus heals, it's because somebody comes up to him and asks him, except on the Sabbath. He'll go into the synagogue and purposely call people out on the Sabbath rather than wait till they come to him. There's some intentionality going on here, okay? So here we see this again, right in our passage, the Sabbath as a time to care. The Sabbath as a time to care. The Lord answered this guy, he says, you hypocrites, do not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it. And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? And we would all say, of course. Very interesting. Brandon shared this with me, and one of the dates I looked it up, and I was very fascinated. Chick-fil-A. They closed on Sundays. But they have opened 4 times on Sundays. And let me tell you when those 4 times were. Local Chick-fil-A's. The first time was 2015 during the Dallas tornadoes. 2016, Orlando mass shooting. 2017, Atlanta airport outage on a Sunday. 2018, Hurricane Florence. Beautiful example of Christians seeing Sabbath as a very important principle, important enough to change their economic practices. But when it was time to care, they were at the plate. Just beautiful, beautiful example. So Jesus looks back at Torah. And in fact, not just Sabbath. Again, Jesus goes after the Super Jews program on food. He goes after it on temple. What Jesus is really up to at least to a degree, is he is not going to allow these Super Jews to redraw God's boundaries and marginalize most of their fellow Jews. So Jesus is going to push this boundary back out and restore it to the place it was intended by the Torah, see? Now, there are some who would argue that this is all Jesus is up to. I think they are wrong. I think Jesus is much, much more radical. I think he is a restorer and he's a revisionist as well in the best sense of the word. And I want to show you how that's the case now. So as we go back, yes, Jesus goes back, looks back at Torah and restores Sabbath as a time to care, but he totally eliminates the idea that Sabbath is a time to separate, or at least prepares for that. And you think with me about when we get to later in the New Testament with the church in Romans and Colossians and all, where all of a sudden the only one of the 10 commandments that is not reiterated in some form in the New Testament is the longest commandment of all, the Sabbath commandment. And I would argue that Jesus is preparing the way for that with how he deals with Sabbath. Now, this looks forward to the new covenant, and it takes us back here with Jesus and these practices that are right in the Old Testament, right in the Bible. Think about food. What did Jesus have to say about food? Did he restore and agree with the food laws as they were written in the Torah? Well, Mark doesn't seem to think so. Notice, Jesus says, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him?" Well, wait a minute. What about Leviticus? "Since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, is expelled." And Mark, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writes, "Thus he declared all foods clean." So much for food as an identity marker for the people of God. Enjoy your BLT. What about sacred space? What about that temple where only the Jews could go? The Samaritans had their mountain where only the Samaritans could go. And what does Jesus say to the woman at the well? That second passage down there, "The hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So much for sacred space. What about Sabbath? Well, we don't really have time to make the case I would like to make here. I can refer you to some reading that might cure you of insomnia, most of you. But let me just give you a teaser, because I think Sabbath is totally part of this whole picture of Jesus preparing us for the new covenant. I'm going to take you to a passage. Well, I won't put it on the screen till I read the first part of the passage and explain it. It's in Mark chapter 2, 23. It's another one of the Sabbath controversies. And you can turn there if you can turn fast, but you don't really need to. This will be familiar. It says, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain." Background. God had this law in the Old Testament where, you harvest your field, but you don't go back and make sure you get every little thing. After you've harvested once, you leave the leftovers for the poor, and then they can walk through and glean, okay? Kind of like God providing manna for his people back in the wilderness, okay? Well, the Pharisees didn't like what the disciples were doing, and they said to Jesus, "Look, why are your disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And for years I read this, I said, yeah, those mean-spirited Pharisees, they don't care. They don't see Sabbath as a time to care. But I think they were right, as upon further reflection. I think the Pharisees were right. Even a broken clock is right once in a while, right? Well, twice a day. And so here's why I think they were right. Think about it. If you're a Jew, Pharisee or otherwise, it doesn't matter. You have a command in the Old Testament, don't work on the Sabbath. You live in an agrarian society where the boundaries of work versus non-work is not clear as driving down to Northrop or whatever and putting in your hours. You're an agrarian. You have to decide what is work and what is not. It's just part of the deal. And it is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of Sabbath law to say we shouldn't be gleaning on Saturday because God commanded Israel not to collect manna on Saturday. It makes perfect sense. And so not just Pharisees, Philo of Alexandria, a Jew out in Egypt, the Essenes, later rabbinic writing, all agreed that you don't gather grain on the Sabbath. That is unlawful, just like it was unlawful for Israel to gather manna on the Sabbath. This seems like it's common sense, not just mean-spirited Phariseeism. And you know something? As we read on in this passage, Jesus agrees that it was unlawful. By the analogy he uses, there's no other way around it. Notice what he says. Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, ate the bread of presence, which is what? Not lawful. And otherwise, but for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who... Jesus is basically saying, yeah, you're right. But look what David did. And then he goes on and says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, again, don't have time to develop this like it would be ideal to do that. But folks, Sabbath is something else that is going to be no longer. So what Jesus is doing is not just restoring Torah and busting out these tight boundaries set up by these super Jews, these Pharisees and others, and getting it out to where it was before. What he's doing is preparing for Pentecost, folks. He's going to unpack food. He's going to unpack Sabbath. He's going to unpack temple. He's going to unpack all these things that marked out God's people as an ethnic group who descended from Abraham, because there's going to be a day when all the nations of the world are going to worship Yahweh. And that day has come, and you and I are in this auditorium doing that right now. That brings us to Sabbath in the New Covenant, where, as we mentioned, we're not surprised to find that there is no Sabbath law. There is a Sabbath principle we'll come back to before we leave. But notice, some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Therefore, do not let anybody condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths. Part of our freedom in Christ. Of course, it's not a freedom we use to serve ourselves. It's a freedom we use to serve one another. This is part of our freedom in Christ. So you know what? You can go home and have a ham lunch for Mother's Day. And if your church has services on Saturday night, or Friday night for that matter, feel free to worship then. We are not under the Sabbath law. So the when is optional, okay? Hours during the day. God's left it up to you and I, as we're grinding away at work or whatever we're doing, to be aware of our own rhythms and know when to stop and sit and rest and be quiet. So also, pick your day during the week. Pick your weeks during the year. So the when is optional. Okay, OCF, we pick Sunday. It's traditional to worship on Sunday. Fine. It doesn't have nothing. We could be doing what we're doing on Wednesday. If all of a sudden you all had to work on Sunday and we had to switch church to Wednesday, so be it. Now, that sounds so weird to some of you, but this is the new covenant. This is the new covenant, okay? The why is not. Folks, we were made to rest. We were made to rest. The insanity of some of these aerospace corporations forcing their employees to work 80 hours a week to compete with their fellow employees for raises and on recognition and promotion is ridiculous. And we have had Christians who have quit their jobs and sought other jobs rightly for those very reasons. Now, to be sure, there are going to be seasons where we're going to work 80 hours for a week or two or whatever. We know that. But those seasons, at the end of those seasons, we need to clearly see on the horizon room for margin, room for Sabbath in our lives, or we're going to grind ourselves into the ground. Okay? We've been made to trust. We've been made to trust. We've been made to work hard and then stop and realize that in the final analysis, God's the one that provides job, money, food, everything on the table. We were made to care. And again, if we're so wrapped up in our own agenda that we don't have any margin, we don't have any time to care. We don't have any time to care for our own families. We have a culture just full of this double income stuff where people are just going 100 miles an hour. A couple next to us, she's a dermatologist, he's an investment banker, they just had their first baby. They got a nanny in the house, and they got all this stuff going on, trying to manage, in order to maintain a lifestyle, among other things. Where's the time to be quiet enough in our own lives to notice the needs of others? And finally, we were made to reflect. We were made to reflect. I don't know about you, but all it takes me, and I'm a Bible scholar of all things, all it takes me is a week away from Sunday worship to need to hit the reset button spiritually. I'm just being honest with you. I come in here Sunday morning, and it's so refreshing just to look at the words and sing the words on the worship screen. Because all of a sudden, I am reset. I'm reminded God is in control, and I'm reminded that God is on my side. All of a sudden, life starts to make sense. I'm recalibrated. I can go out and deal with life as God intends. God has created you and I, and He's given us an owner's manual, and it's important to understand that owner's manual. We spent some time trying to understand it, one part of it in detail this morning, and thank you for bearing with me. But the takeaway from this is we betray and ignore God's guidance for our lives to our own peril. It's not going to hurt God, but it's going to be profoundly damaging to us if we don't allow margin, Sabbath in our own lives. So if you're struggling with this, you just sit down with your calendar when you get home And sit down with your spouse or your friend or whoever, your kids or whoever is in your life, or just by yourself down on your calendar and say, I need margin. Where am I going to put it? Because the culture will eat you alive if you do not intentionally schedule that margin. Maybe that's why thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy was the longest commandment in the Bible. Let's pray.